Welcome to Human Powered, the podcast about creating a high-performing agency or consultancy business. I'm Trenton Moss, leadership coach, exited agency founder, and author of the book Human Powered. And on my podcast, my guests spill their secrets about how they've created high-performing teams and how this has translated into running a high-performing business. And today I have Steven Writer-Maguire, director at Clarasys. Steven, hello.
Hello, Trenton. Nice to see you.
Yeah, you too. Thank you so much for joining today. Let me quickly introduce you, Steven. So you're a director at Clarasys, the experienced consultancy. You've been with the business for around 8 years now, and you've overseen growth from 40 to well over 200 people across that time. And Clarasys wins a ton of awards, around being one of the UK's leading management consultants, also being one of the best places to work. So I think you're going to have loads of fantastic things to talk about today. Let's dive straight in. Tell us, Steven, what's the secret? What's the secret to a high-performing consultancy business in 2024?
Yeah, that is a big old question, and thank you for the intro, Trenton. Don't we sound grown up? The secret to a high-performing consulting business, that there's lots written around having a compelling proposition, be differentiated, don't be generalists, price well, treat your clients well, look after your people. It's all good advice, and it's all things that any firm worth their salt should be doing. The thing I think that the secret to high performance, though, is break out of the consulting norms that often founders have probably come from in terms of some of the bigger four. And what I mean by that, at the heart of it is trust your people, treat them like grown-ups, and allow them to play to their strengths. And it sounds quite glib, and I don't want to dumb it down, but it's very hard to do when you come pre-wired with 10, 15, 20 years of training from a big four, where you actually hire smart people and get out of their way and allow them to solve problems in a way that maybe you wouldn't have. And as founders and starters of consulting business, it's very, very hard because you're probably an individual who's very driven and has a very set way or clear idea of the way things should be done. But the trick to high performance, and importantly, scaling that performance, is trust your people.
So if trusting your people is such a hard thing to do for so many consultancy leaders, how have you gone about making that a reality?
There's a couple of ways, and some are structural and some are behavioral. So from a structure point of view, we believe in a team of teams model. So it's breaking some of the norms of traditional hierarchy where partners or directors have the say on everything and they're the ones who lead everything, to creating multi-discipline teams of whatever level people, but where the expertise truly resides, and trusting them collectively to solve the problem for the clients. And that applies to internal things as well. And it also goes back to the point about trust, where if somebody comes to us and says, hey, can we spend X thousands of pounds on doing a new thing? Rather than going to the most senior person they can see in the office and say, can I do that thing? What we would say is use something we call the advice process, which is get a bunch of people around the table who know about the thing that you want to do, have a couple of challenges in there, so some devil's advocates, probably have somebody who's got a view of the purse strings, just, so you don't go crazy, and then allow that room to come up with that decision and truly trust the outcome of that process and resist the temptation to jump in and go, oh, but I would do it this way, because the collective brain will solve, and provided you have enough diversity in that conversation, then you mitigate groupthink as well. So there's some structural things. I think there's behaviorally as well, you have to create psychological safety for people to get things wrong. And now that psychological safety is more than saying, hey, you have psychological safety and we trust you if things go wrong, right? You actually have to walk that walk. And we have something, excuse the language, at Clarasys, which we should call the fuck up challenge, the fuck up championship. And it is where genuinely, where people might have done eye-wateringly, oh, let's not do that again with a client. And so, or sometimes they're humorous or what have you. But you create the conversation with your people to acknowledge when something hasn't gone to plan. And you share it, you celebrate it, you learn from it, and that just then becomes the norm. It's inherent in our feedback culture as well, and that goes 360. That's the sort of up and down, and you have to go with it. You have to trust that process, and you constantly, as we get bigger, checking in on decisions of, are we slipping into some hierarchical behaviors? Are we defaulting to the most senior person in the room, and kind of facilitating and reminding people that they have the trust and the space to speak up on things.
I love that. I love the fuck up championship. And it's really interesting you're saying that everyone from all across the business is, submitting their entry to that. What was your most recent entry to the fuck up championship?
So a fuck up challenge that I'm going to be submitting for myself this month is related to an internal piece of work I was doing on our operating model. And I wanted to change the way we do some of our client planning routines, sort of quarterly and monthly, and actually devolving more of that into the individual portfolios rather than it all being centralized. And I have just made the problem way too big. So there is a phrase I have sometimes, am I solving up or am I solving down? And in solving up and making this problem too big, I started thinking about culture and operating model and ways of working. And actually all I was trying to do was just push certain accountabilities down into the team. And if I just solved that, it would have been very, very easy. Instead, I've created a whole bunch of drama and a load of conversations that just didn't need to be happening. So I think I'll probably offer that one up this month.
Who knows? You might even win the championship with that one.
Who knows?
But it's a lovely thing to have one of the business leaders putting forward how you've messed up in the fuck up championship. And I guess the learning that comes along with that. And clearly you doing that is going to help to create that psychological safety. You've got a big business though. What else do you do to embed that psychological safety across the whole business?
Well, a lot of it comes down to alignment and are people clear where the business is going? Because you then have something to anchor your safety to, because you have clarity. Having a purpose statement, which for Clarasys is to make a lasting difference the way people live, work, and grow, and a set of clear statements of what the business is intending to do and what are the things we're not going to do, gives people a framework to work within that gives them some grounding. And I think we've still got a ton of work to do to get that right, because you have to keep refreshing it. You have to keep checking in, and you're hiring people that, as well, who won't have been involved when it was set, 3-4 years ago. So it has to be a living, breathing thing that you're constantly over communicating. And the way to do that isn't in front of the whole business and broadcasting. For me, it's about storytelling and teaching our people how to bring to life our purpose in every day, whether it's in their team or their function or the client they're working with, and keep checking in on it. And then I think storytelling's become a bit of a lost art, actually, and I feel very, very passionate about it. But how we have shared stories over time through the millennia, stories survive. And I think for consulting firms to teach their people the art of storytelling is great for the client work, but it's how culture pervades, and it's how those remember when ... we worked on X project, that they're the things that people remember, and that's how culture and the memories of our culture that you want to keep, and also the bits you want to tweak, is how they live.
I really like that. So we've got this 2030 vision, this purpose statement, making a lasting difference to the way people live, work, and grow. And for you, it's not about just putting that in some doc or some deck so it gathers dust. It's about continually bringing that to life through storytelling. Yeah,
absolutely. We've all seen those bland, boring vision, mission, value statements that get stuck by the lift or by reception. You can do clever things with them, and you can get a cartoonist to make it look funky or use words that are a bit more impactful. But values and behaviors, they have to show up every single day, and naming them and talking about them is key. We have an internal thing called the Kudos system, and it's an app that everyone has, and you get so many points each month that you can award people, and they're tied to living our values. So when you give someone feedback, you deliberately tag it to which value have they demonstrated, and the points add up, and it's a nominal amount of cash that kind of rolls through every quarter. But it becomes a little way of gamifying it, and another little small thing that ensures our culture lives on. And it's actually, when you asked the earlier question about a high performing consulting firm, it's the small things that actually make the difference. You can do big new initiatives, or drive new ways of working through the business. They will have an impact for sure. But if you let go or forget the small things that matter, it's the weathering effect on a rock, right? Over time, they chip away at your business and your culture, and then, like erosion on a rock, once it's happened, and you only notice it when it's too late.
What are some of the other things that you do to keep your purpose statement front of mind, and to keep those values front of mind, and to make sure that your culture day in, day out is being lived how you want it to be lived?
There's a few things. So feedback is a big part of that. Celebrating when someone has lived those values, and actually telling them and sharing that, and making that visible. And also in the moment or after a meeting, if somebody has tripped up on one, or you think let's talk about that and have a coaching conversation about that. So creating, again, that muscle memory and the habits of giving feedback, so it doesn't become a big thing, once every 6 months. So that keeps our culture alive. Transparency and trust is big too. So how the business is performing, all of our dashboards, all of the financial data is visible for everybody to see. So when the business is performing well, people can see, great, we can go and invest, we can go and recruit more, we can go and try bigger things or take some risk. Or if the business is behind plan, everyone knows that, they can see it, so that can then factor into their own decision making as part of the advice process to, maybe now is not the time to think about investing 50K in a brand new thing that we've never sold before, right? But you don't have to tell people that. They can make that decision themselves, because they can see the data. So we talk a lot about acting as owners of the business. I mean, we're employee owned, but the trust owns the shares on behalf of the employees. But ownership and employee ownership mindset is a big thing. So if it really was your cash to spend, would you spend it on that thing?
Interesting what you're saying at the end there. If it really was your cash, would you spend it? That ties in nicely to how you do business expenses.
Yes, we don't have an expense policy. We have the red face policy. And what that means is, if you had to stand in front of your nan or your parents and explain away why you've spent 150 quid on lunch with somebody, does it pass the red face test? Would you be okay saying that to them? And it's brilliant, because it self-polices probably 90% of our expenses. So account teams are empowered to say, on this project, we want to say thank you to the client. Should we go for a pizza, or should we go to the Ritz? It's 9:30 in the office. We're at a go live deadline. Should I get a taxi home? Rather than somebody going, oh, what does the policy says? Oh, it says every week I can claim up to £25 in whatever. Yes, I would say clearly, if it's dark, it's winter, it's cold, you've been working a shift, get a taxi home, get home safe, get home well. You'll be better set for the next day. That seems obvious to me, but so many firms I've worked with or for in the past, where you find people looking on the intranet site for, what are my per diems, or how much can I charge up to?
So it sounds like very much your leadership style is around hiring really great people, getting out of their way, empowering them to make the right decisions. How do you make sure you don't accidentally revert back to kind of older, more traditional, more hierarchical ways of working?
There's a great book, Leluc, talks about reinventing organizations. And it talks about a teal organization, and the old hierarchical red organizations is very much sort of the big four, top down leadership, and teal as a color is more teams of teams. So I think there are practices that we have in place now that is actually very, very difficult to be hierarchical here now at Clarasys. And when it does show up in from a behaviors point of view, it just really, really stands out. So the organization now, as we get bigger, culture in a hierarchical organization, which might serve them well in the early days, gets eroded very, very quickly. Then people talk about, oh, remember when we were smaller, we could have intimacy on this, and we could have more control. At Clarasys now, our culture actually gets stronger as we get bigger, because the firm starts to develop antibodies to that kind of behavior or that kind of way of working, because it is just it just stands out as being just so different. And don't get me wrong, I mean, it comes with a bunch of quirks, right? I mean, I don't want to be evangelical to the extent that say it's the only way to be, because when you don't have hierarchy, you have to teach people how the flow of the business works and help them get comfortable with self-organizing and being trusted that they can make decisions, or they can go and get a bunch of people together to make a decision with them. And for new hires, particularly experienced new hires, they sometimes come in and think we're a bunch of crackpots. It's all a bit kumbaya, and where's the structure and where's the discipline? But there is structure and there is discipline, but it's just a bit different. And you have to be very careful that you create freedom within a set of frameworks and permissions. I'm actually not worried that we'll revert back to hierarchical ways. What I am more worried about is the extent to which you have a coaching culture, the extent to which you have non-hierarchy. You forget that people still have the permission to lead, and the temptation to over-consult on something because they're worried about being hierarchical, where if you do have the expertise, if you do have the experience, it is absolutely fine to say, this is the way we're going to do it, or this is the way I think we should do it. So we're now realizing we're having to teach a whole bunch of people to lead in a more influential, more inspiring way rather than a dictatorial way.
So how do you get that balance between providing strong leadership and having enough of a contribution from the group, enough of a kind of democratic feel, but without it just getting stuck in everyone offering an opinion?
Oh no, that happens. When you have any more than 7 or 8 people trying to make a decision, it's hopeless. It won't happen. And that probably goes for most organizations. So there are red flags as to when you can enter this sort of analysis paralysis or over consulting. The advice process is actually a good example, where you get a bunch of people together to help you make a decision. As a decision-making forum, it'll fail, right? You're not abdicating responsibility for a decision. You're asking for input from a deliberately diverse set of people. So you are still accountable for that decision. And sometimes you get stuck where people confuse the advice process as a decision-making process.
So, Steven, you've talked a lot about how you set the business up in a way to enable people to thrive. I'm curious, though, about how are you more deliberate in helping to develop everyone in the team in terms of their leadership, their emotional intelligence, their resilience skills?
Yeah, and consulting requires a lot of resilience at times. There is a course that everybody goes through, and it's sort of over 4 or 5 chapters, called Clarasys Code. And it's one of the ways that we bring to life our values, because we talk a lot about what are the behaviors that enable or inhibit our values. And we go a lot into a lot of the core coaching techniques, sort of feedback, dealing with conflict, and really also exploring how the brain works, kind of how dopamine and cortisol can have impact on people's stress levels, and when to notice those, not just in our colleagues, but also our clients, right? I mean, we're all human beings. We're not psychologists for sure, but being very intentional around teaching emotional intelligence related skills, empathy, listening, the power of great questions, just those 3 things that are ingredients for great consulting. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth. Use them in that ratio, right? It's things like that make great consultants. Those that can really hear the facts, but also say, well, but I'm sensing, the way you described that didn't feel right. What's going on? Developing intuition. You've got to be careful with intuition, because you can make, judgments that might not be true. But having a team of people who are aware of the full sort of spectrum of the bits of the brain, whether that's holistic, emotional, analytical, data, and we talk about walking around the brain, even when you're constructing a message or a pitch to a client, to make sure that it's addressing all of those components.
And tell us a bit about the kind of practical application of the Clarasys Code program. How do you practically go about imparting this information to the team?
So it's a bunch of self-study, it's face-to-face sort of training and workshops. It's tools that show up in lots of places in our decision making. So we have a couple of examples. The Clarasys triangle. When we're making a decision, we talk about people, business, and clients. What's the impact? Which corner is pulling harder than the other? And the goal isn't to get a decision that is bang in the center, but it's if a decision is pulling more towards a client or towards our people, it's just recognizing that that's happening and understanding the consequences of that. So there's tools like that come out of Code. Other ones are in the consulting environment. We're very good at creating drama triangles where you'll have a victim, a villain, and a hero. And a consultant might come to you and saying, "Oh, that client's being horrible to me." And then someone says, "Aha, let me go and have a word with them." And you create this drama triangle. And the way through that is to coach that individual to go and have that conversation themselves, or give them the feedback, or ask a bunch of questions to help understand where the client might be coming from. So there's lots of little snippets or tools that now just become common vocabulary at Clarasys. It just becomes part of the DNA of how we run. And it's quite nice, actually, because some ideas, I remember when the Clarasys triangle surfaced in a scheduling meeting I was in probably 7 years ago, and inadvertently drew something on the wall, and suddenly it stuck, and then everyone starts talking about it, and 8 years later the Clarasys triangle is the thing we've been doing forever, and it's just to become folklore.
I think that ties in really nicely to what you were talking about before, where you were saying that your culture starts becoming so embedded, and you're so intentional with the frameworks that you use, and it creates this common vocabulary that as you grow, that common vocabulary grows with you, and you naturally develop those antibodies to the incorrect type of behavior.
Yeah, and you still have to create space so you avoid groupthink and you don't start hiring people in your own image. So we have to be very careful with that, and our recruitment approach sort of designs that in. But I think it's okay to celebrate the strength of a culture without it being cultish. People at Clarasys will often, their friends will say to them, "Will you shut up about Clarasys? I get that you like your job and I hate mine." But it comes with trade-offs, right? I mean, a firm that gets under your skin is good and bad. Sometimes decisions can feel agonizing because if it's possible to care too much. Sometimes you just need to cut to the chase. Sometimes you need to be able to say to people, "Do you know what? I'm sorry, you're not going to like this. You're going to have to do this project in this way, or work for this client you didn't want to." And that's okay too. I mean, we're a commercial grown-up business. We sometimes have to make difficult decisions. But the difference is in explaining the why. Rather than a just do, it's let me help you understand why this is important. And then people generally go, "Okay, I get it. I might not like it, but I understand it." And then they feel part of the decision-making process rather than being told to go do something. The whole parent-child dynamic is that's another thing that I talk quite a bit about, where as firms scale up, the brand then becomes a thing. And when people talk about Clarasys as this entity over there that Clarasys has done, or Clarasys has decided that we're going to do X, Y, Z, I'm like, hang on a minute, no, it's us. We've decided, And this parent-child dynamic is one that you have to keep a watch out for. And culture will change. You will have cultural dialects within different bits of the business. They're all anchored by the same set of values, but it can still express itself in different ways. That's okay. And as you get bigger, process will change, governance will change. You'll do different things that some people may or may not like. But if they start to say, "Oh, we don't do that thing anymore, our culture's changed." No, it hasn't. Process has changed. Culture is how we behave. Culture is the assumptions we choose to make about each other or the firm, or the belief that we have we're doing the right thing. If those things change, right, you've got nobody to blame but ourselves, because we'll get stuff wrong and we might make mistakes. We'll hold our hands up, we'll move on when we go past it. But that's not culture changing. That's just we made a bad decision. And we'll make them all in all our careers. Hindsight's a wonderful thing, but when you have the freedom and psychological safety to go, actually, do you know what? That thing we kicked off 12 months ago, not a good idea, wish we hadn't done it. When that becomes the normal conversation, then your culture then isn't at risk, right?
Businesses often get concerned about losing their culture as they grow. And what you're saying is almost the exact opposite of that. As you grow, your process changes, but actually you can maintain exactly the same culture.
I think so. I mean, as our kids grow, we don't say, oh, our children have, well, some children might become monsters. They're just growing up, right? They're getting longer limbs, they're gangly, they'll make bad choices in their teenage years. You know, they'll spend money they haven't got. The true is for consulting firms. But if you have that anchor and your rock around your values and your purpose, you're clear the impact you want to have on your clients, on your people, and the world at large and the community at large, then you're good, right? You can change shape. You could do different stuff. You could hire different people. Maybe actually culture is becoming too soft a word. It's actually about having clarity on the purpose and impact as a business you want to have. As a consultant, I love that because you can measure impact. Some people say you can measure culture, but it gets harder. But when you can be intentional about your purpose and being purpose-led in the work that you do and the role you want to play in society, then I think it can be easier to ensure that you don't lose sight of that.
So as you're saying, it's real clarity on purpose and impact, and then being very intentional around that to guide the behavior of you and everyone in the business. And when you're doing all of that, everything that you've spoken about today, I guess my question to you almost is, so what? Like, what's the impact of doing all of this?
Yeah, well, then it comes into how do you measure value? A lot of our clients as well are starting to realize that, you know, shareholder value and bottom line, you have to have that, right? Because you got to be viable, but being commercially viable so that you can have an impact and lead a purposeful business and a purposeful life is becoming way more part of the conversation that we're having with our people and with clients. And you know, what's Clarasys' purpose is to make a lasting difference the way people live, work, and grow. There's still room. There's still freedom within that to interpret that how you like, because live, work, and grow is actually about the what we do, the type of things that we do. For me, my purpose within Clarasys is to build the best firm our people will ever work for. In 10 years' time, whether they spent 2 months with us or 20 years with us, they'll go, that bit on my CV, do you remember when we did that? That was bloody amazing. I worked with some amazing people. We did some cool stuff. I learned loads. And I want to take what I learned there and apply that. Maybe I might be building and running my own firm. I might be working with a client. I want to take some of that with me. So the standard to build the best firm our people will ever work for is now actually really hard because, I mean, the climate right now for a lot of consulting firms is pretty tough. I still think that we're doing the right thing at all times by our people to the extent we can. But I feel like it's a standard that's going to keep me sharp for years to come. But that's genuinely why I do get out of bed. It's not to go and do X particular type of, you know, customer experience work with Salesforce. Yes, we'll do that as part of the journey, but the why behind that journey is to create those moments in people's careers that they will look back on and feel really proud of.
That's very inspiring, a very inspiring why. Stephen, you've shared so many wonderful examples of the things that you're doing at Clarasys, and clearly it's working. You know, this incredible growth over the last few years. Talk to me a bit about what's next for you in the business. What's in store for you over the next year or so?
We are doubling down on particular areas of expertise around customer experience and purpose and business architecture and a few areas like that. The impact of AI on consulting is really exciting. A lot of people are worried about that, but whether that's as co-pilots and helping people do things smarter and faster, or whether it's doing really innovative things with clients around automated voice recognition for booking systems, etc. This is really cutting edge stuff that's really cool. But I think we're at over the next year, our stage of growth at around sort of 200 people, and with the US office, we have to avoid falling into a revenue hungry machine, because consulting firms are revenue monsters and our order book is only as long as the next set of statements of work. So when you're doing real advisory work, your revenue cliff or slope is 3-4 months out all the time. So you constantly have to be growing. So to avoid the temptation to sell bigger, commoditized, lower rate stuff to keep people busy, we have to keep honest on depth of expertise, whether that's functional or industry, having real insight and clarity on our advisory type of work that then fuels the rest of the business. We will keep growing, but we don't need to be growing at 25-30% year on year over the next period. So next year is a bit of a period of refocusing on expertise, consolidating in a few areas, really focusing on the next level of senior leadership and what do we need, who are they, how do we help them grow to their next chapter of the careers. I mean, we've got people that joined us straight out of uni 10 years ago. We have a 10-year anniversaries for people. I think, God, we hired them as graduates 10 years ago, and they're now running like global transformation programs, and it's phenomenal to see. So thinking, what are they going to look like in another 5 or 10 years' time? Is how do we nurture that next level of talent?
Yeah, almost like that succession planning.
Yeah, it's super exciting, and it's terrifying just trying to keep up with most of them, right?
Stephen, thank you so much for joining today. As I said, you've shared so many wonderful insights. Clarasys sounds like this wonderful environment that you've created. Thank you so much for joining and sharing everything.
Thanks for having me, Trenton.
You've been listening to Human Powered, the podcast all about creating a high-performing agency or consultancy business. Thanks for tuning in.